So you can see what I have here, right? Is this is a Docker Compose.yaml file, right? And this is just the version of like Docker Compose essentially that we're using. And then we have this key for services, all right? So this is like you can imagine like each image, if Docker Compose is going to be a mechanism, it does a couple things for us, but one major thing it does is it's a mechanism to kind of like tie together or put on the same, allow two different containers to talk to each other and to communicate with another, right? So we can basically boot up multiple different containers, each that maybe do different things under the same like network or really like in the same, specify them in the same Docker Compose file. Okay, so what would be an example of this? Like, maybe we want to connect our web image and container to like Postgres, and we have a separate image and container for that. Or maybe we want to connect like our backend container and a Docker file for that to like our front end, and we have maybe a separate Docker file for that. Okay, so this gets into if you heard of, maybe some of you have heard of the term like microservices. Okay, that's kind of the idea. It's like we could have, if you wanted to, we could maybe put all these components under one image, but instead, we have them under separate different components, what's called like separate different services. So in this case, maybe like what the lab will build up to is like one service will be the front end, Streamlit. Another service will be like the back end. That would be like your Flask API. And then another service will be like Postgres, the database. What's the benefit of doing something like this? Well, right, it goes back to like this favorite term of like separation of concerns. And this has multiple benefits. One is it like keeps things, simple, right? In other words, like you're not going to be referencing, here we're using Streamlit, but you could imagine this is like React and a bunch of JavaScript, right? And maybe like that means that we need some like Node packages. Well, if we want to like keep all this stuff separate, one good way to do that and to make sure that it's separate so that where we can kind of manage what we have to worry about is to have it in a separate folder and in a separate image. Okay, and this way, like the front end, if you're working on a front end task, then you just have to worry about, then you have to worry about this stuff. But if you're working on a back end task, then you don't have to worry about this, right? So much of what we do in programming is really just about like keeping our brain from having to worry about too many things. And microservices is kind of an example of that. Like that's a main benefit of it, is it allows us just to really have to worry about certain, some components at a time, not everything. Okay, right, and then same thing, backend, like this would be, mainly like Python based. And then Postgres is going to be our SQL. Okay, so it allows these things to be fairly separate. Okay, so what's one of the services, in this case, what we're doing is this would be for our Flask service. Okay, so this is going to be one of my services. You can imagine I had like a separate one here called like Streamlit or front end, but for now I'll just have web. And then this is how I'm going to like build, that service. So I can just do, and if we didn't have Docker Compose, how would we do this? We'd have to do something like, here's my Docker file. I'd have to do Docker build dot, right? I can't, my brain's a little scattered, but it's like just Docker build and then the build context, right? With the dot. So here it's very similar, right? We're gonna say, how do we build in this particular service? And we say, hey, it's going to go to, the context is the current directory, right? That's what the dot means. And that's where our Docker file is, okay? And then this is the file itself. And then you can just build it the same way, very similar to how you would with Docker, but you do Docker Compose build, okay? So I'm using Docker Compose build, and it's finding the Docker file, and then once it finds the Docker file, it's building it here. The next thing, I think if we do like Docker Compose image, I wonder if we can do Docker Compose image ls. No, we can't. The next thing that we would want to do is actually like boot up this container. And if you imagine, if we like built the image, right? So this is my Flask image. I'm going to like run it, and let's just see what we can do. Here's my Docker file. Let's do docker build -t backend dot. Okay. All right. So I just built something called backend. And what would be next? I'm going to do docker run backend, and I want to port. Right. This is going to be a Flask backend. So I'm going to probably want to port. Maybe it's running on port 5000. So I'll port my local 3000, or let's say 5001, over to port 5000 in the actual image. So I'm just using Docker right now. I'm not using Docker Compose. I just want to like make an example. Cannot locate the Flask application. Okay, so I'm fine with the porting, it seems like, but now I want to specify an environmental variable, right? You can kind of see the error. It says we cannot locate the Flask application. So specify an environmental variable, for example, the Flask app, right? And let's say that's going to point to, basically I want to specify for Flask's purposes, like where is my Flask app located? So it's in project and init. All right. So this is just what you have, as we kind of seen, right? If you're going to use Flask run, if you're going to use this argument, then that means we have to specify in the environmental variable, where does our Flask application live? So it lives in like project init. Let me just check my notes to make sure I have the right file path. Yeah, so that's right. So what we can do is we can now just do Flask app, that environmental variable, you can see that here, the -e equals, and I think I can just specify it in quotes, project / dunder init.py. So I'm basically just going to run this, port 5000 here to 5001 on my laptop, and specify the environmental variable. That way, when we run Flask run, it knows where my Flask application lives, and that looks pretty good. And I click on this, and of course I should switch it over to 5001, and we're good. Okay, we all recognize that error message. We just need to go to /users. All right, so here we're using just Docker. The next thing to do is like kind of specify these arguments. Notice what I did. This is the command I used. We basically want to like translate these arguments right here into Docker Compose. So with Docker Compose, we can actually like codify, these arguments. So that's what we'll do next. And here we're saying, we're all about this service. We call it web. This is how you build the service. Now we'll say like, these are arguments you're going to use when you run the service. So the first one is ports. That's probably about this. Okay. And there are multiple ports. I'll just write it and then I'll explain it. So we can do something like this. 5001 to 5000. Okay. This is the equivalent of this. What is this dash about? In YAML, this hyphen is like to specify a list element. So the idea is maybe there's multiple ports we want to bind mount. So you have to specify a list, because maybe if there's like, if say we have something else running, like Streamlit inside the same image, we won't, but it'll be like, I forget which one it is, 8532. We'll point to like, 8532. Maybe that goes to 5002. So my only point is just that, like, why do we need this hyphen here? It's because we're just bind mounting, or we're just mapping one set of ports, one port to something on my laptop, but we could map even more. And because of that, you use the hyphen, because the hyphen indicates that this is an element in a list, right? So that's why this is ports and not port. Okay, next thing. Next thing is to then specify the environmental variable. So it's the same kind of thing. You can do environment, : and now same thing here, same issue is that there might be multiple environmental variables. In this case, I'm setting an environmental variable of Flask app equal to this. All right, and that's it basically. That's kind of it. So now, if you think about what we've done so far, 1, we've specified how to build the image, and then 2, we specified how to run the image. Okay? So if you build the image, we kind of need that to specify the context, but no more, right? Because now we can just do, as long as I'm where my Docker file is, I can do Docker compose, build, and I don't need the dot anymore because the dot is codified, and that works. And then I can also do Docker compose up, okay? And you can see that now this is running everything, right? So the same thing, I should be able to go to 5001 again, and we're good, right? Again, we recognize this. Okay. So that's kind of a one main benefit of using Docker Compose is it's kind of like even more, right? It tells me, it codifies kind of like all of my Docker configuration, right? All these arguments that we would pass through normally, we now don't need to do that anymore, right? They're in the Docker Compose file. So it makes it a little bit easier. Same thing with building, right? We don't have to do the Docker build dot, or, we can just run Docker Compose build, and it knows, hey, there's a Docker file located in the same directory as my Docker Compose file, and I should build that. Okay.
Jeff,
Yeah.
the what is it like? We can do it whatever name, or it's like a keyword for not
Yeah, you
compose.
can call it anything you want.
Okay, got it.
hmm Can we name images like we do for building images separately? Yeah, you can. I think there is an argument here for like image. Uh, and you can specify. You can either like. I think if you here is where you would specify like the image name. I'm not. Don't quote me on that. Uh, well, I'd have to Google that. But that's essentially I think what you would have to do. I'm not quite sure. We should Google that. All right.
Hey Jeff, a quick question then.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the benefit that we eventually need only one command for building all the images there are for the services. But coming to the CI/CD side of things, how does that work in conjunction with Compose?
Yes, you can still. So we can think about. Um, so let's think about it. We'd probably still have to. I guess you'd make a commit. My guess is this: you would make a commit. You would potentially. You would. One thing you could do is you could do Docker build dot, and then one thing I've seen. I forget if it was with Franklin, or I forget who I was talking about this with, but you can specify the image. I think it was you, Conwell. We can specify the image, and then this image can point to the location of the image in your ECR. And what we'll do is it will pull down the same way that if I don't have an image locally, and I do, if I do Docker run, and I specify an image name here that I don't have locally, right? It will pull that image down and boot it up. It's the same thing with Docker Compose. You can build an image, push it to your ECR, and then here you can specify the location of that image, like it can be the URL, and it will pull it down, right? And then boot it up if you do Docker run. Does that make sense? So you don't say you can do the build. Here I'm using Docker Compose to both build and run the image, but you could imagine I do a separate process for building, which is just like build each image, and then I push it up to ECR, and then here I specify that ECR repository as something to basically pull down and boot up. Right? So there's something you can kind of think of things like that. In doing that, right, you probably it's a little more complicated than that because you have to change the version. I think my guess is you'd have to change the version, or you'd have to just wipe out. I guess you'd probably be okay so long as that image doesn't exist locally. It will re-pull it down. So there are things like that you can do. Um, Okay, cool. So we kind of get like what this is doing for us. It's basically codifying our Docker command arguments. The other thing, and maybe even like a larger benefit to this is that it allows our different containers to talk to one another. So once we do Docker Compose, if I do Docker Compose up, right, you can see it's containing this it's building this container. One thing, by the way, so we're building this thing up. We have a container running. You need to be in the correct folder. So right now, I just want to show you, I don't see a Docker Compose file. If I want to say like Docker Compose PS or like show me all the containers, right, I get this error that says no configuration file not found. You have to be in the same directory as your Docker Compose in order to actually like work with the CLI, with the command line interface. So let's go to that same location. And now I'm in no, I'm not quite yet. It's called users. And now I'm in the same spot, right? So if I do Docker Compose PS this time, you see that? Here's the, right? Here's kind of all that information. The service is web. This is the command that booted up the container, right? That's coming from here. Okay, Flask run. This is the image that it built for me. Users web. Where did it get that from? I guess from the folder name was called users. And then here I said the service was web. So it built that image for me. I think it's probably, my guess is that is, yeah, there it is. So that's on my system, users web. And then this is the name of this. Oh, actually, this is the name of the service. So now let's say I want to like exec into this running container, right? So here's my running container. It says users web 1, but my guess is we can actually just use the name of the service to exec in. So let's do that. Docker Compose exec -it, and then we'll use sh, I think, and that works. Okay, so this is actually a very nice thing because the fact that I get to just refer to this as web and not users web 1. Why? Because like this feels more dynamic. You know what I mean? Like this is kind of like created for me, this web 1, whereas this one is I just know the name of the service, right? It's specified right here. All right, and now I can dig around, etc., right, and see what's going on. Let's see what else. Other things, you can obviously, by the way, you can explore like the command lines, arguments, and different commands that you can use just by typing in Docker Compose, and then it shows you, everything that you can do. So for instance, you can see this down, stop, and remove containers and networks. So let's do Docker Compose down, and now it's stopping, right, the relevant containers. That's pretty nice. And we should see that eventually shut down here. Okay, so far, right, we've seen like how do we kind of codify now finally exited. How do we codify our Docker commands? How do we kind of work a little bit with the command line interface? There's obviously more things you can do, except, right, it's kind of showing you that. The next thing is, again, like how to get these different services to talk to each other. So let's go there. So this is that part. So here we are moving to that architecture, where basically what I have is I have a backend, and then I also have a database. Okay? So this part's the same, right? This I just called it something different, so I'm calling it API. I'm saying, how do I build this thing? So I want to go to a Docker file, and to build this API service, where should that Docker file exist? Right? Inside API. So from the Docker Compose file, you'd go to API, and then in this API is my Docker file. Okay? Same thing here, ports, just mapping one of them. I guess 5,000 in the container, 3,000 on my laptop. Then I'm specifying now, I guess, a second environmental variable. So the first one is staying the same, project init.py. And then I'm getting to having this new one. We'll talk more about this in a second. Then this depends on DB says, same thing as in Terraform that we saw, don't boot up this container until you first booted up my database image. So notice in this case, I'm not specifying how to build it, right? That's because this image, Postgres, lives on Docker Hub, right? So it's going to basically, if I don't have this image downloaded on my machine, it's going to look for it on Docker Hub, pull it down, and then boot it up. And then these environmental variables, if you remember that crazy Postgres lab we did previously, right? These are coming from the image, right? This is giving me different kind of environmental variables I can use. Postgres password, Postgres user, right? That'll create the database with those users and passwords. And then here we're mapping the port, right? I'm mapping this port 5432 to 5432, I believe on my laptop. I think so. Maybe I'd have to think about that. And then same thing, the volume. The volume exists within the Docker Compose world, Postgres data. So I'm bind mounting here, right? Remember those when I store the data in Postgres, the data is stored on this file, and I want to save it. So we're storing it in this volume, where that volume is created right here. So here I'm creating a volume, and here I'm specifying that when you save the data in Postgres, write it to that volume that we just created here called Postgres data. Right, so it's really, I guess, 3 different kind of objects that you can think about, like 3 different services. An API, a database. This is not technically a service, and a volume. Okay. Now, and in both cases, I'm specifying environmental variables. I'm specifying the ports. The main difference is here I'm specifying how do you build it, right? Because I'm building it from this Docker file. Here I'm not. Here I'm saying, hey, this is an image, right? Here, this is an image, and look for it on Docker Hub, the image called Postgres. So now if I do Docker, I just want to do Docker Compose up. Actually, I need to make sure I'm in the right folder. Multi-services compose. Inside services, that's where my Docker Compose file is. And then in that Docker Compose file, we have, it's really just this one, thing that has my one Docker file, because this database service is, right, coming from the image itself. So I should just be able to do Docker Compose up. And you can see it's pulling down the database image. You see that? Why? Because it's going to look for it on Docker Hub. And then once it's pulled down, then it will boot it up. Both services, right? 2 different containers. The Postgres container that we're referring to as DB, the DB service, and the API that we're referring to, and this web that we're referring to as API. Here, right? And that's coming from this part. Yeah, Conwell?
Yeah, just regarding the volumes, as we see, there are 2 containers that are booted up. So this volumes, how do we know on which container this will be created on, this volume you mentioned?
Well, it's really, you can think of it as kind of like 3 separate kind of objects, right? But the link to a container is occurring right here. So inside the DB, this DB service, we're saying, hey, whenever you write data, right? If I insert data into Postgres, I really want that data, normally that data will live on this file, whatever right here. Really though, it's going to be written into my volume.
Yeah, understood. But then why the need for specifying it additionally in line
Down here, because it's not smart enough to just create this thing. This is the first time it first needs to create it and then reference it.
But then when you say first created, so my understanding is line 26 will be executed behind in the
No,
background.
it doesn't necessarily go in order. You know what I mean? It's not from top to bottom, right?
Right. So when it tries to create a volume, my question still lies: how will it know which container to create this volume from?
It's not. It's not. Yeah, you're not thinking of it as like this volume's created in a container, right? The volume exists separately. It's like a separate entity, and like the volume exists in kind of Docker land, and right here we're saying connect that volume, use that volume for write the data in this container to this volume.
I see.
Yeah. So this is just a separate object that now I'm plugging into when I boot up my Docker, this Docker container, when I do that, there's an argument that says, look for this volume and anything written to here, write to this volume. All right, let's take a look at this part. Okay, so this is what can get like confused. Oh, I broke something. Did I? Maybe it restarted. So you can see that this is interesting. It's creating a network for me. We kind of saw that. And it's creating both services. And now we're getting the logs. This is my database. The files belonging to this user will be owned by Postgres. So it created the database. And then once this thing is booting up, then it is creating my backend API service. Sometimes what happens, it is having an issue with trying to connect to the server DB. Basically meaning it's trying to connect to my database, and it's probably just didn't wait long enough. We see that now finally the database got created in the DB database, and my guess is now the web. So let me just maybe go a little bit deeper into what's going on here. So the key part, here's kind of the key part of like what's going to connect my API to my database. All right. It's this data. If you look at this database URL, right, this is an environmental variable. So inside the container, I'm basically creating an environmental variable called database URL. And what is this doing? This is saying like, like we always do this, right? In order to say like Scicop G2 should connect to the Postgres service, right? Like we're not doing MySQL, we're doing Postgres. This is like the username. This is my password, username, password. And then this is actually like the key thing. Normally we don't do like @db, right? Normally we do like 0. We say like, the local host 127, whatever that number is, or like some sort of outside, right? Or if it's RDS, we'll put like the IP address here, okay? But in this case, it's DB. And the reason why is because this is creating a network, right? And both the services exist on the same network, like both API and DB. And you can reference, like if I want to get to this container, all I need to do is basically type in DB. And in this container, on port 5432, that's how you connect to the database. So what does that mean? Once I have this database URL set in my environmental variable, then inside the init, I can osn.environment.get the database URL. So basically, here I'm setting the database URL as environmental variable. Here I'm reading from it. So that means that this SQL database URI will be this thing. Okay? So that's what this is, what this value is. And then here I'm specifying, connecting to the database at this kind of IP address. This IP address is the other container. And then finally here I create a table, I insert in a user, and I do select all from users. So the key thing here is, I have this database running on a different service in a different container, but because I'm using Docker Compose, it's actually very easy for me to like connect to it because I don't have to specify the IP address here. I just specify the name of the database service, which is DB. Okay? So I could literally put this string in right here if I want to. It's not a good idea. Like that's not the best practice. The best practice is, keep it over here. That way I can easily change it. If for whatever reason I want to change this, I could just change this text right here. Okay. So let's see. I think this probably... So what I think was happening over here was essentially it's trying to connect. Now maybe you can understand this a little better. If you look at the error message here, it says connection at server DB, right? Port 5432. So even though it's like waiting, I don't think it waited long enough. It basically just waited until, I guess, this guy said okay, and then it saw, okay, I depend on the DB, right? This API depends on the DB. So it's just going to wait until, I guess, it got an okay from here. But the DB wasn't done building yet. So then it tried, and it couldn't connect yet. And then finally the DB kept going. You see that? So it's still going. And now my guess is if I do, what I want to do is like Docker compose a log, right? And init process is complete, ready for startup. So we probably can just go to, I mean, the easiest check would be to go to port 3000. So let's just do that, right? And if that can, well, that's not nice. Let's take a look. It could be, look, I don't even see a request made. Let's change the port here to 5001. So this should be 5001 on my laptop. Let's just do this again. Okay, so you can see port 5000. Let's go to port 5001. There, we're actually okay. That might feel a little too simple, but that did work. So basically, I'm mapping the port 5001 on my laptop. That's going to port 5000 here. What you can do is that's then, it has already created the table. It has inserted in Maggie Simpson, and then here we're doing select all from users, right? And then this database URL is this string right over here, okay? So it's looking at the DB 5432 and getting to that port, and then that's breaking. Or that's working, right? That's why it's able to connect. We could, like I said, if you wanted to, like you could even probably replace this right here, I believe. Okay? And this DB, it will look for this to see, is this a service inside of Docker land, inside of your Docker network? Find that it is, and then connect to it over here, your DB service. All right? One thing I typically like to do, you can, like I said, you can always, let's just go to the multi-services thing. So you can go to services and do Docker. Sometimes I'll do like Docker compose log, logs. You can see the logs, and you can look at the logs just from one service if you want. So here it's all about the database service. Hold on, there's a question. Okay. In the past, I used networks in addition. Then each service that needed connection to reference the network. So you did service by. Yeah, I don't really use networks unless I have to. Like, that's what's going on under the hood. Is Docker Compose is creating a network for us, and both the API and the database are on the same network. Both of these containers are on the same network, and that's what allows us to reference the database, like specify this word DB, and then it knows that, okay, that means this thing right here. But I'm sure you can, there are other ways to develop this. Let's see, the other thing that you can still do, just in terms of debugging, is, right, we can do Docker Compose PS. So you can see that both of these services are running. Okay, here's my API. Here's the DB. You can do Docker Compose exec -it into the API. Oh, I need to specify the service. Sorry. So that's this API. Right? And then from here, I'm in Bash, but but you can like try. You could try to connect, from like we can plug this in and connect to my database from this container right here. So you can kind of like see how that's happening. I wonder, let's just try for a second. So I just opened up a Python console. I'm in my API container. Okay. I'm going to specify this as my database URI. And then let's import, I wonder if I can do this. Yep, so I have Postgres. Here's my connection. Okay, so that's my database, right? And because I'm in the container, I should be able to do connection.all select all from users. And there it is, okay? Where did this thing come from? It came from the connection to my database, where that database is this guy, okay? Which is running Postgres. And that's where my Maggie Simpson data lives, okay? We're inserting it into Postgres. So what's the, what is the point of all this? The point is the main thing, it's a little like subtle or small, I guess, but it's actually like makes your life so much easier, is the fact that I can reference another container just by using the name, just by doing DB right here. And that from inside the container, right here, I'm inside that container, I can literally just type the name DB and it knows, okay, that connection is on my network. And so when I do select all, it's really connecting from this image, from this container is connecting to this, from this container is connecting to this container. That's the whole thing. Got it? Questions about this? It's okay if you have a question. All right. So just know that, right? Normally, what do? We specify the IP address, but in this case, we're just specifying the service, and we don't have to worry about where this, like the port or whatever, like the specific place this thing's running on my computer, because we just specify by the service name. That's kind of it.
So the idea is that if we don't do it if we don't use Docker Compose, we're gonna run two separate containers separately, right?
Yes.
It's for Postgres and one for API.
Yeah, I mean, you might remember we did this actually with the Terraform lab. With the Terraform lab, we remember we did this on an EC2 machine, which is kind of crazy. Like we did Docker run, basically like the back end, and we did like Docker run, the Streamlit, and then the way that, it's like, how could we have this back end make a request, like, to my Streamlit, or how can I have my Streamlit container make a request to my back end? And the way we did that was we did like Docker network create, and then we called it, like bridge or something, and because once you do that and you specify that both of these containers are running on the same network, then you get to, from the Streamlit app, say like request.get to the, basically your back end, instead of localhost here, it's backend, right? It's just the name of the, right? It's just the name of the service. And then you say like port 5000 or something like that. Okay? And that's making a request to your backend API. Maybe, yeah. /users or something like that. So this whole magic occurs because we create a network. We have two different containers booted up on the same network, and then here you just specify the name of the container. This is doing the exact same thing. Two different containers. We're connecting to this container because they're on the same, because Docker Compose will put them on the same network, and then here, instead of the URL, you just specify the name of the service, right here. This is exactly the same thing. Instead of the URL, just specify the name of the service, of the name of the container. Right? And because they're on the same network, it knows what this means. Cool. Questions about that or anything for me to clarify? Let me see. Is it common practice to hard code the environmental variables in a Docker file? Normally, you'd put as much as possible in the Docker Compose. You know why? Because it's very easy. You know, this is kind of the overall configuration, and it's easy for me to, one, change this thing. You know, like I don't have to go digging through. I can just change it here. And then two, because think about how these actually tie together, right? If I want to change this, I want to make sure, you know, it's kind of easy for me to spot check and make sure. You could even go further than that with these files. You can like create a variable and interpolate and all that. You can do that, but we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, Jeff, this is fine, but what about passwords, other credentials?
Yeah, passwords, you'll read it. You know, you can read it from your local environment. You know, so you could imagine like if this was GitHub Actions, in the GitHub Actions, you'd have that secret, and then that secret would set the environmental variable inside your GitHub Actions environment, and then you'd read from that GitHub Actions environment into this file, something like that. Yeah. So that way you don't have to, you're right, like codify this here, something like that. Cool. All right. I think that's it for me then.